Okay, welcome back everybody for the second part of lecture on chapter one material. We left off by discussing the testing of a hypotheses. And so we're going to go ahead and move on from there. We're going to just sort of jump into things. Um, really, the hard sciences, we can say in the social sciences that those in physics, chemistry, biology, etc., they really have this advantage of using controlled laboratory experiments to test their hypotheses, meaning that researchers can choose whether and how how much they want to alter their explanatory variables. They can manipulate those variables quite a bit in a laboratory, whereas in the social sciences, particularly with political science, we are unable to do that. So when you're manipulating those explanatory variables, you can see how that would impact the phenomena that they are interested in studying. Our research, on the other hand, operates in the real world, and studying real world politics in a scientific way does pose some really huge challenges. Countries' economics, their culture, their geography, particularly with some countries that are landlocked and other countries that have a huge kind of ocean line and with many ports. Some countries are have share many neighbors in terms of their geographical characteristics, where they may have 7 or 8 different borders that they share. Got to learn to get along with others. Their resources, some are resource rich in oil, that gives a huge advantage, and other countries may just be a desert with no oil, which is a really horrible situation, or resource rich in terms of lumber and timber, such as Canada and the United States. And so, because we have countries, their economies, their culture, their geography, their resources, all of that is vastly different, um, and it poses some hurdles for us. Their political structures are highly diverse. So when we go to try to control any one variable, change is very difficult. A related problem is multi-causality, or what happens when variables are interconnected and interact to produce particular outcomes. Variations in things like a country's gun control policy, or whether countries are a democracy or not, tend to be produced by multiple interrelated factors rather than having just sort of one single explanation as to why a country may have strict or loose gun control laws. So we've got to account for all these factors. This problem should not be confused with endogeneity. We're going to come back to the endogeneity problem in a moment, but that occurs where variables may act as both cause and effect in a relationship to one another. All right, so we have some research terms here under causality. As a science, political scientists are attempting to understand how the world works. I think I've mentioned that, at least I did in the part one of chapter one lecture, a couple of different times. So, more than describing what is politics, we really want to understand what the why of politics. Why are some countries democracies and others are authoritarian? Why do some people escape poverty while others remain trapped in these types of conditions? Why do people become terrorists? That's a major question to be addressed by political scientists, and very many different variation of answers out there. So when we come to the answers of these questions, political scientists make predictions. Again, I've alluded to that in part one of chapter one's lecture. These predictions, they construct a hypothesis, an educated guess about the cause and effect relationships. students really, might be familiar with a hypothesis that is written in the form of, if this happens, then this. If we have X, then Y, or we would expect Y to come after X. Um, and that's because this is the language that is used in hypotheses writing in the hard sciences. If you've taken a hard science class, you're very familiar with this. These are deterministic hypotheses, as they assume the cause and effect is always true. Could be a thing of such as gravity. If you drop your pen, you know it's going to fall to the floor. As long as there's nothing there preventing it from getting to the floor, it's going to hit the next object that it encounters. Right? Or if I heat up water, then it's going to turn to steam. Right? Those are things that have been proven over time. Humans are really not as well behaved as chemicals or gravity or certain laws in the hard sciences. They're very irrational. They're very, well, some may say irrational, but unpredictable. We can say that at least. So social scientists prefer to use this term probabilistic hypotheses, which, usually they hold true, but not always. We could use the example of more democratic countries are less likely to experience civil war than non-democracies, or oil-rich economies. Going back to that example, the democratic peace theory is really what I'm getting at there, where you have, if you're a democracy is not going to go to war with another democracy. In addition, a democracy probably won't be fighting with itself. Although we did in this country experience a civil war when we were considered a democracy. The other example that I can give are, oil-rich countries, oil-rich economies, I should say, are more prone to becoming non-democracies. That's pretty general. Some democracies will have civil wars, and some oil-rich economies may become democracies. But if most countries follow this pattern, it really helps us inch a little bit closer to making accurate predictions about the world. So comparativists also face a lot of different challenges simply in gathering data. I mentioned a small n problem where we have countries, a finite amount of countries. Generally, we aren't going to see a whole new crop of countries exploding onto the international scene. One of the newest countries in the world is South Sudan, and they didn't come into existence until around 2014 or 2015, I believe. I was working in Europe at the time and had met with some of the people who were helping draw the line. It really is a line between Sudan and South Sudan that's denoted by religion, where you have Muslim majorities in Sudan and Christian majorities in South Sudan. But there's a data problem, right? That much is clear. Let's get back on track to that for a second. A biology study might gather information on thousands of subjects where there are only about 200 countries in the world, as I've mentioned before, and not all have become really relevant for a particular topic. For instance, studying a political party competition really only makes sense in democracies. Comparative researchers also face the challenges in gathering the information they need because of language difficulties or technology limits, particularly with Wi-Fi and the internet, making the necessary field work very resource intensive. And as a result, it tends to narrow the focus of any one individual study. You know, comparative researchers are seeking to control exogenous variables. They're seeking to improve their data gathering focus by engaging in area studies, which means they focus on studying a particular region of the world such as the Middle East, North Africa, East Europe, where etc., where some their similar variables are clustered around rather than studying different parts of the world or individual countries. Area studies, unfortunately, they limit the generalizability of the findings and tend to overrepresent Europe, the region of the world where most comparativists can have, easy access, speak the language. It's very, Eurocentric, Anglo-Saxon, um, English-driven kind of way of viewing the world. Okay, so can we make a science of comparative politics? That is our question, right? Um, Scholars really have to be careful to be sure that they are finding a way to select cases, and that when they select those cases, it doesn't lead them to a bias um, in their study. Um, Selection bias can lead to incorrect conclusions about correlation and causation. So the over reliance of European case studies, for instance, may lead us to make some assumptions about how things work, and that they may make sense in Europe, but they can't travel and they can't translate very well to other areas like Latin America, Africa, or Asia. Um, So, for instance, Europe's study of highly destructive religions and nationalist warfare has led to the development of a strict separation of church and state and an emphasis on individualism over collective identity. But are these factors really necessary for democracy to work? Can democracy work in more collectivist societies with strong traditional values? That's an open ended question. Um, let's go ahead and move on. All right. I mentioned endogeneity in a prior lecture. This is when it occurs where variables may act as both a cause and effect in relationship to one another. So, in other words, causality may be a two-way street, but certainly not a one-way street. Um, if we are trying to understand how the world works, it's going to take more than describing what is politics. We want to understand the why of politics. I've mentioned that in an earlier section. So when things come down to more modern comparative theories, modernization theory, this is a theory where there is an assertion that as societies develop, as they become more advanced with higher education rates, lower infant mortality, better healthcare systems, etc., that it should lead to where we would take on a common set of characteristics, including democracy and capitalism. If we learned anything from the Cold War and its ending, is that capitalism essentially won the day. Capitalism won out, right? Now we have an instance of countries such as China where they've remained very steeped and entrenched in communist politics, but the country itself, in terms of how the economy is run, is very capitalistic. Sell a lot of their goods to us, and of course, right now they're developing their own electric vehicle that's going to compete with Tesla, and so that's an interesting dynamic. But the behavioral revolution in the second bullet point here on this slide is a movement within political science that took root in the 1950s and 60s, where there was a development of general theories about individual political behavior that could be applicable across all countries. this empirical evidence challenged modernization theories, which were earlier on. Then we move about a decade or two into the 1970s, and critiques emerge that are questioning the behavioral revolution. This ultimately leads to several divisions in theory and methodology. So, looking at the differences in research methodology, I mentioned that we dive closer, dive a little bit more into qualitative and quantitative methods. Qualitative, as you can see here, is the study through in-depth investigation of a limited number of cases. Could be historical case analysis. It excels in detail-oriented theory environment, and it's really good at that inductive reasoning that I had talked about before. On the other hand, quantitative methods are things like survey data. They have a large a large sample size. You can use, it's statistical analysis, um, where the quantitative method excels is really in testing where patterns are generalizable, and sort of on the other end of the spectrum, it's good at deductive reasoning, whereas the qualitative part is good at inductive reasoning. And really, I think when I study comparative politics, whatever question a student has, research question, I should say, that should drive the method rather than choosing a method and letting that drive your research. You don't want to choose the method prior to answering a question and say, I'm only going to use quantitative um, research methodology. That's just a recipe for disaster, or I'm only going to use qualitative. The best is to sort of have a mixed methods approach to include both qualitative and quantitative methods. These things have been debated in political science departments across universities in the United States, and it's ruined some friendships. Some researchers decide to pit themselves only as quantitative researchers or only qualitative, and I think that's a really big mistake. Being well versed in both methods is highly desirable. It's going to make you a much more well-rounded researcher, having both of those skill sets. And I think some researchers definitely kind of gravitate towards one over the other simply because they find one a little bit easier to grasp, the understanding of that. If you're not good at math, then you're going to be, more of a qualitative person. If you're really good at math and statistics, then you're going to be, in the quant side. But having a mixed methods approach is really something that I strongly believe in, and that I think is good for social science research. I believe this. We've got rat choice. A couple more slides. Okay, this is my last slide for this second part, and then we're going to wrap up chapter one. But the rational choice thing is really straightforward, really easy to kind of understand, because a lot of us as humans sort of act in this way in our everyday lives. It's assuming that individuals are going to weigh the costs and benefits of making choices to maximize their utility, maximize their benefit, their gains that they get out of something, out of a decision that they're making. This can be likened to students who might decide to get out a blank sheet of paper, and they're deciding which college they're going to commit to after Butte, and they write down the pros and cons of colleges that they may select, with programs that are stronger than others, or in certain if you're location bound, that's one thing. You want to be close to family, maybe you choose Chico State. If you want to be far away from family, you choose the University of Hawaii, but then you have the added cost, where living in Honolulu is going to be much more expensive than rent in Chico, California. And so you write down that pros and cons list, right? I mean, that's just really what rat choice is all about. It's weighing the costs and benefits. We don't always, pull out a pros and cons list, and some decisions are a little bit easier to make, in terms of what groceries we're going to pick up, one day, or the route that we're going to take when we're driving in our car. Other things are very consequential. They're big time decisions that really have to be thought out, with a lot more time. And within the rat choice kind of theory and that framework, we have game theory, which is approaching, this area that this approach, it emphasizes how actors or organizations are going to behave in their goal to influence others. It's built upon the assumptions of rational choice. Game theory was extremely instrumental in, helping explain the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Graham Allison's book on that is really a big contribution to the field. And so, in contrast to approaches that emphasize how culture or institutions constrain political choice, rational choice in game theory, particularly in game theory, there's a lot of quantitative methods that are being used, and that sort of thing. So, we're laying the foundation for this course. I hope you've enjoyed going through these lectures with me, and I hope that I'm breaking them up enough, so that they're not too boring. We're going to move on to chapter 2 material here shortly, and so make sure that you start reading that chapter next.